Logan? What are you doing here?
Oh, I was just looking for a meal.
Welfare check didn't come in?
Well, no, it did, but my dad just, blew on a poker.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, well, why are you here?
Oh, my utilities got shut off yesterday and won't be back on till tomorrow morning, so I'm just, riding it out until then.
Man, it's kind of cold. Wouldn't it just make more sense to stay in your...
No, it honestly feels way warmer out here than it does in my house.
Okay.
So, have you found anything to eat?
No, all I found was an empty Jack Daniels bottle and a pack of Newports.
Lucky you. Oh, look, it's a VHS tape. This gives me an idea. I'll, see you later.
Alright, guess it's Newports for dinner.
The idea of VHS horror has been a concept for many years. For those unaware, VHS horror, also known as analog horror, is the use of vintage analog media to create an uncomfortable or disturbing atmosphere. The origins of VHS horror date back to the turn of the new millennium with films such as The Ring and The Blair Witch Project. Both of these films utilized VHS tapes from camcorders as storytelling devices used to progress the narrative. This style hadn't been done before, at least not to the extent it was done in both films. It's this originality that led to both of these films becoming cult classics in the world of horror. These were also some of the first notable films associated with the found footage genre. Found footage films are horror films that play on the idea that the footage found within the movie is real. Some consider this genre to be the most frightening due to how realistic some of the films can be. Take the Blair Witch Project for example. It follows 3 film students investigating the case of the Blair Witch, a legendary murderer in the local area. The students fuel their investigation with the use of information from the local townspeople as well as old articles. Eventually, the students find themselves lost in the woods whilst looking for the Blair Witch. This inevitably leads to their demise. And that's it. The film had a fairly simple and grounded premise, well as grounded as a murderous witch can be. The film's simplistic yet disturbing nature led to it dominating the box office, with the film grossing $250 million worldwide on a budget of 60 grand. Now I'd be lying if I didn't say the success of this film led to a slew of mediocre found footage slop throughout the decade. Because it did. Don't get me wrong, not every film was bad. There were a few diamonds in the rough like Wreck and Host, but there were also films like Megan is Missing and Paranormal Activity that made me want to light my DVD player on fire. Speaking of Paranormal Activity, it was the most profitable horror movie of all time, grossing nearly $200 million on a budget of $15,000. You know what? I'm just gonna make my own shitty Paranormal Activity films. Maybe then I won't have to eat dead rats for dinner. Anyways, around this time, another form of media began to dabble with the VHS horror style. As in 2003, Rockstar North released a cult classic that would have an everlasting impact on the general audience that played it: Manhunt. Manhunt follows James Earl Cash, a carrier criminal who's recently been sent to death row. Cash would remain on death row for another 3 years until the day of his execution in November of 2003. Rather than getting a lethal injection, however, Cash would find himself awakening in an abandoned coffee shop. As it turns out, he was never given the lethal injection after all, but rather some form of sedative. This was due to the intervention of a man by the name of Lionel Starkweather. Starkweather was a disgraced filmmaker who had to turn to the seedier side of the film industry after the decline of his movie career. He was given more freedom with his new films, which mainly consisted of porn.
Porn? Where?
Logan, get the fuck out of my house. Starkweather saved Cash from his execution in order to make him star in a new snuff film he was creating that would have followed Cash murdering various gangs throughout the city. This eventually falls through, however, as Starkweather betrays Cash and has his family murdered before eventually trying to off Cash himself. Starkweather ultimately fails as Cash gets his revenge and brutally dismembers him with a chainsaw. The game ends with Cash going into hiding after his crime spree and is never seen again. Now, despite Manhunt releasing over 20 years ago, it's still regarded as one of Rockstar North's best releases. Not only for its dark story and the stream of controversy that followed it, but also for the unique visual style that it presented. The style overall was pretty uncommon at the time, and it wouldn't be until the late 2000s and early 2010s that people's intrigue with the aesthetic would begin to grow rapidly. This rapid growth would mostly be owed to the creation of creepypastas. Now, I'm sure most of you are familiar with creepypastas, but for those unaware, creepypastas are fictional horror stories that typically revolve around a disturbing entity or being. Some of the more well-known creepypastas were Sonic.exe, Jeff the Killer, and most notably, Slender Man. Slender Man was a creepypasta uploaded to the Something Awful forums in the summer of 2009 and followed the titular character Slender Man, a tall and thin supernatural entity with a black suit and tie and a featureless white face. Slender Man is said to be a demonic being that abducts and brainwashes innocent people, primarily children. So basically, he was just a YouTuber. Get it? Cause they're all fucking pedophiles? Aw shit, that includes me. Due to how vague the original creepypasta was, it led to many people creating their own interpretations of the character. The more well-known interpretations of Slender Man ran were the Marble Hornets web series and the Slender Man horror games. Now I know most of you have probably heard of Marble Hornets. Wait, you haven't? You mean you actually leave your fucking house? Well, to get you up to speed, Marble Hornets was a web series that ran from 2009 to 2014 and consisted of 133 episodes. The series followed Jay, a film student who had found a box of old tapes owned by his friend Alex. The tapes in question were a part of a film that Alex was creating called Marble Hornets. Jay would upload 87 entries of the Marble Hornets series, along with other videos of him discussing who Alex was and how his life entered a downward spiral when filming Marble Hornets. This downward spiral would come to a climax when Alex killed half of the Marble Hornets cast, including Jay. In all honesty, there's a lot more to Marble Hornets than this, but the story is fairly long and complex. What wasn't complex, however, was the first Slender Man horror game. The first Slender Man game released was Slender in the 8 Pages in 2012. Slender in the 8 Pages followed a young girl collecting 8 pages around a shitty Unity forest whilst also trying to survive Slender Man. You can tell the game's pretty simple when the title explains half the damn game. But despite the game being more bland than my fucking voice, it was still fascinating to many people. Mainly because it was reminiscent of horror games from the late 90s due to its older looking 3D style and of course VHS aesthetic. While the aesthetic was fairly subtle, it was able to enhance the disturbing nature of the game, despite its simplicity. This simplicity, however, would be less prominent with the following game, Slender the Arrival. Since Slender the Arrival had a budget that went into the double digits, it was actually able to have a full story with characters and an environment that didn't look like a third grade diorama. I will say, however, these improved graphics definitely took away from the charm that was present in the first game. But whether or not this charm was missing from the next game didn't really matter because both games were immensely popular. You couldn't go anywhere on the internet without being bombarded by Slender Man creepypastas, shitty fan games, art, really anything you could slap his dumbass face on. Yes, I know he doesn't have a face. In all honesty, I believe that the Slender games were the start of a new era for VHS horror games. Throughout the 2010s, there would be a plethora of horror games that incorporated elements of VHS horror. Some of the most popular of the decade include Five Nights at Freddy's, Tattletale, and Duck Season. Five Nights at Freddy's, also known as FNAF, follows a security guard working the night shift at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, an 80s pizzeria akin to places like Showbiz and Chuck E. Cheese. The night guard has to survive from 12 to 6 a.m. whilst avoiding possessed homicidal animatronics. Tattletale follows a young boy who can't help but open one of his presents a week before Christmas. This, however, would prove to be one of the biggest mistakes he's ever made, as this gift would make his life a living hell. The gift in question was a Tattletale, an animatronic plush similar to Furby's from the late 90s. Throughout the week up until Christmas, the young boy finds himself awakening in the middle of the night due to his demonic Furby's demands. Whether that be needing to be brushed, fed, charged, assisted in a demonic incantation, the usual shit. All of this while also trying to survive Mama, the mother of all Tattletales. Not only is she the main antagonist throughout the game, but she also carries a strong resemblance to a big green egg. Duck Season follows a young boy in the late 80s who just got a new game for his King Bit game system. It's just a shittier NES. As he plays the game, however, he starts to notice more and more strange happenings around him, particularly with the dog mascot inside the game. Other than 2 of the 3 games following young boys, okay, that didn't sound right, there's one key aspect they all have: nostalgia. Each game incorporates common childhood memories, animatronic pizzerias, Furbies, and game cartridges. And while these memories aren't specific to everyone's childhood, I sure as hell know I didn't have a Furby. Have you seen those fuckers? Regardless, these are objects most commonly associated with childhood. So then you might ask, why is nostalgia such a major part of these games? Well, it's because these childhood memories are often seen as happy and lighthearted, so it's all the more disturbing when these memories are altered to create a sinister undertone. This sinister undertone would continue to be prevalent in future games that apply the VHS style. Speaking of which, as the 2010s drew to a close, there was a rise in VHS-styled horror games, as in games that were purposely made to emulate the style of titles from the late 90s. One of the main studios responsible for this revitalization of the genre was Puppet Combo, a small indie horror game studio well known for publishing games that imitate the style of releases from the original PlayStation. Some of the more notable games within their catalog include Power Drill Massacre and The Night Ripper. The former sees you as a woman named Megan, who, after being injured in a car accident, flees into the woods to get help. Eventually, she stumbles upon an abandoned building and ends up accidentally locking herself inside. As she wanders the corridors in search of an exit, she hears the sound of a power drill and comes to the realization that she's not alone. The latter follows a young woman trying to survive a sadistic killer stalking her in a black sedan. Now, as if it wasn't obvious already, these games are heavily influenced by 80s slasher films. You've got the strong and capable final girl, the people who are just there to die, gratuitous nudity, and of course the titular slasher. Looking at the Puppet Combo games in retrospect, it's pretty clear that the games don't take themselves too seriously. I mean, their main focus is to mimic 80s slashers, which are inherently pretty stupid. Not to say the games aren't scary, they definitely have their moments, but overall they're not made to psychologically scar you. The same, however, can't be said for Chilla's arts. In contrast to Puppet Combo's stylized imitation of 80s slashers, Chilla's art takes a more grounded approach, primarily focusing on disturbing yet plausible situations. Take the closing shift. It follows a young woman simply going throughout her typical working life. Everything's fine until she begins receiving strange letters and weird looks from strangers. As the days go by, she grows ever the more fearful of her potential stalker. This all culminates with her discovering that her stalker had been living in the store. After this disturbing discovery, she finds herself face to face with her stalker. Luckily, she's able to fend off his attack and kills him via dropped brick. The final shot of the game shows the woman on her phone in her apartment, with the closet door behind her slowly opening. The reason this game is so disturbing is because of how plausible the situation is. Sure, the stalker living inside the store is pretty out there, but it's not completely unbelievable. One thing I'd also like to point out is how well Chilla's art is able to capitalize on red herrings. They do this by presenting a variety of suspicious characters in their games, leaving it up to the player to decide if they're the antagonist. This is most evident in Parasocial, where there are multiple suspects due to how little is known about the real stalker's identity. Chilla's art games also include one of the most integral aspects of VHS horror: isolation. This may seem fairly ironic considering most Chilla's art games take place in cities and high-density areas. This isn't a problem, however, as despite being surrounded by many people, the player still feels alone. Harking back to what I said earlier, in the eyes of the player, everyone's a suspect. You don't know who to trust. This means that even if you're in a cafe surrounded by a dozen people, they're all still strangers, and no matter how nice or how weird some may seem, you don't know who they really are and what intentions they have. The character interactions really sell this and are what make these games feel so realistic. But I can't discuss realism without bringing up Fears to Fathom. Releasing in 2021, Fears to Fathom is an episodic psychological horror series that's based on true events. Basically, each episode of Fears to Fathom is a real story sent in by a random person. So far, there are 5 episodes in the series: Home Alone, Norwood Hitchhike, Carson House, Ironbark Lookout, and the most recent entry, Woodbury Getaway. Despite the first entry in the series, Home Alone, seeming pretty tame compared to the episodes that would follow, it does a great job at encapsulating the overall feel of the series. That, of course, being an uncomfortable and anxiety-induced feeling. This mainly stems from the overall environment that surrounds the player. From the movement of individuals that can be missed in the blink of an eye to the spine-chilling music cues that emphasize something terrible is about to happen to you. All of this, along with the fact that these episodes are based on true events, really solidifies how disturbing these games are. Fears to Fathom also incorporates the use of your microphone audio, meaning when hiding you have to stay as quiet as possible in order to avoid being found. Despite being a fairly simple feature, it really enhances the overall experience, making it feel more like a game of stealth rather than a series of endless cat and mouse chases. What was once a lesser known and more obscure style is now a fully fledged genre with an ever-growing audience. And despite the endless slew of mediocre horror games hopping on the VHS horror bandwagon, they'll never take away from the games that impacted people so deeply.